Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for a panel discussion on Colombia's 2022 election outlook. I am Guillermo Zubillaga, Senior Director of Public Policy Programs and Corporate Relations at the AUCOA. As you all know, Colombia has legislative elections in March and presidential elections in May. Gustavo Petro is ahead by a wide margin. Last week, a Bloomberg headline called Colombian assets prize for Petro risk. The country lost its investment grade rating in 2021 after the government halted a tax reform proposal following widespread social unrest. On a global scale, interest rates and inflation are rising. The peso has devalued in line with many emerging market currencies. So to tackle these issues, we have a great panel of experts with us today here in New York and in Bogota. We have Silvana Amaya, Senior Analyst of Global Risk Analysis at Control Risk, joining us from Bogota. Alberto Bernal, here to my immediate right. He's the Chief Emerging Markets and Global Strategist at XP Investment. To Alberto's right is Renzo, I'm saying literal right, not metaphorical. Renzo Merino, Vice President and Senior Analyst at the Sovereign Risk Group at Moody's Investor Service. Welcome, Renzo. And our moderator joining us virtually from Bogota is Sergio Guzmán, who's a co-founder of Colombia Risk Analysis, also a contributor to our publication, America's Quarterly. Thank you, Sergio. So the panel aims to discuss the political and economic outlook for Colombia in a busy electoral year. This program is private, by invitation only, and it's on the record, and it's being recorded. The video will be published on our website in the coming days. If you wish to ask a question, please raise your hand virtually, and you will be called by Sergio. Or also you can send him a chat via Zoom, and Sergio will try to call you. We really want to hear from you, and we're going to leave a good amount of time for questions from the audience. You are muted now, but at the Q&A part, you will be able to unmute. So without further ado, Sergio, the floor is yours. Thank you to all the panelists for being here today.
Guillermo, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I recognize a lot of friends amongst the distinguished guests, and of course, Silvana, Renzo, and Alberto. It's a pleasure to be with you here. I told the other day something that I think people caught on to, 2 out of 3 conversations in Colombia right now are about politics. The third, of course, is about Rodolfo Hernández. So clearly we have a lot of things to discuss. I just wanted to touch base with each one of the panelists today, because if we look at the latest Gallup poll, Colombians are at peak pessimism. And this comes right before, 2 weeks before the congressional elections, which happen on March 13th, and essentially represent the first out of 3 rounds for president. I just want to ask you, when you look at the Gallup poll, and it has negative on cost of living, insecurity, corruption, the economy, unemployment, practically all institutions. I want to ask you first, Silvana, and then Renzo and Alberto, what do you think is the main driver of this pessimism? And how do you think the economy is also responding to this, including, of course, markets? So, Silvana?
Thank you, Sergio, and thank you, everybody, for having us here today. Well, it's a very interesting situation that we're having right now, and I believe that this is part of what we have lived for the past 2 long years of the pandemic. I think the situation has worsened in many of the aspects that you just mentioned that has been asked in this Gallup poll, that evidently people are reacting to a burnout, a situation where there is a dissatisfaction. And the government has been also very much criticized for what they have done so far in many aspects, economic policies, social policies, and in a way, how they have managed the pandemic. So I believe that all these aspects recognize maybe the sort of tiredness of the population, what people are just reacting to, and they believe that it is time for a change. And this indeed has been picked up by some of the candidates as a possibility of change. That's how they frame it. And some of the candidates have been in campaign for basically 4 years now. So they have taken advantage of all these aspects that you just mentioned on how people are feeling And this is also very important to take into account what we saw in April last year that lasted 7 weeks of protests, of social unrest, where people actually expressed themselves as well, saying that they were tired of the situation. And one specific aspect, and I'm sure we're going to touch upon it later on, but just to recognize the importance of it, is corruption. And I think this embraces the entire sentiment of how people are tired of what is happening and how people are asking for a change, not specifically coming from a specific from a point of political left or right, but regardless of this, they ask for a change.
Thank you very much, Silvana. Alberto.
Well, first of all, thank you to the Council of the Americas for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and be here in person for the first time in I don't know how many months. So this is it's a great change. Great to have you here as well, Renzo, be at the same panel with you. You know, Sergio, I think this is, as Silvana was saying, a lot of what we're seeing has to do with the ripple effects of the time, the unprecedented time that we have seen. And we have seen it in elections all over the place. And it's not a right-left issue. Like, for example, in the case of Argentina, the people decided to castigate the left-wing government, sitting government, because they were sick and tired and fed up with the pandemic. So they voted for libertarians and the right, but not necessarily because they suddenly became people that wanted the right to come back, but because they were just protesting against the government. And in a way, it's pretty unfair, because what are you going to do about it? I mean, this is nobody's fault. So this is not Duque's fault. The fact that Colombia had to close for so many months is not Duque's fault. He could have done different things, obviously. The same thing with Fernandez. He could have done much different things. Bolsonaro did not close anything. He's going to lose the election. So it's basically a complete intention to castigate the government that was sitting there, because it's just human nature after so much trauma and so much stress, etc., having to do with the pandemic. The good news is that at least we're seeing a material reactivation of the economy. Sergio, when we published the 2021 yearly in December of 2020, XP said Colombia is going to grow 5% in 2021. And I'm going to be honest with you. How did we come up with the 5%? Because we knew that the economy had fallen like 6% in the year before. We didn't have the final data, but we had the indication that it was going to fall 6%. So 6% down, let's say 5%. But the level of uncertainty on that forecast was immense, because who knew whether or not the vaccines would be available? Who knew whether or not we would have a second, third, fourth, fifth wave? Nobody knew anything. And the reality is that we ended the year with that plus 10% growth. And that's positive. That's very positive, because it's better to grow 10% than 5%. So at least we have some positive piece of news. But again, the level of skepticism from the population is not only an issue from Colombia. I feel it in pretty much almost every other place around the world, because people were very sick and tired of the pandemic, and they need to blame somebody, because that's how we humans are.
Well taken, Alberto. Thank you very much. Renzo, on to you. Can you give us a sense of how you feel this pessimism is affecting markets, and what the reasons for this pessimism are?
Just again, thank you very much for having me here today. Just to try to complement what have been said by my fellow panelists just now. I think it's also important to remember the Latin American context just prior to the pandemic. There was a commodity price shock 5-6 years ago that changed the reality of what we had seen in Latin America for a decade and a half almost, where high commodity prices were very supportive of the expansion of middle classes, which brought about higher expectations from society overall, that in some cases were not met by the own government's capacities to deliver those social services, education, health, etc. And even prior to the pandemic, we had seen a bout of rising social tensions that in some countries manifested in large-scale social protests. We saw it in Colombia. We also saw it in countries like Chile. And in the context of the pandemic, the pandemic itself, because of the nature of the shock, worsened some of those key social aspects that everyday people feel: employment, poverty, affordability of their everyday lives, and so like some of my fellow panelists have already mentioned, that can tire people. And in 2021, in other countries in the region, we saw that the escape valve for these feelings of unmet expectations manifested through outcomes in elections. And the question, I think, for Colombia in the coming months will be what will happen there. So clearly, we're as we'll likely discuss in moments, there are potentially very different outcomes for Colombia and what that could mean for economic growth, for the numbers, and also what the markets think.
No, absolutely. And we'll talk about what the ratings say in a little bit, Renzo, and what the ratings forecasts are. But I want to jump to Alberto, because you talked about a 5% growth projection. I'm curious to know what your firm thinks of growth for 2022, how the elections may end up affecting risk premiums for Colombia. But also, we've seen a number of statements by the leading candidate, Gustavo Petro, on the central bank. We've seen statements from him today about whether or not he would rule by decree potentially, if he wants to do that. How do markets interpret that? How do you think investors are looking at these statements from a candidate that hasn't yet tallied a single vote in the election and is already speaking like he's a winner?
Well, let me tackle the first part of the question, Sergio. For 2022, this is a little bit of a technical issue, but I have to mention it. This is incredible. I could not believe when I saw these numbers. Colombia's rate of growth in the fourth quarter of 2021 was so strong that there's something called the statistical carry, which is the amount of impulse of impulse that the economy will be getting into 2022, which gives us that without growth on each quarter on a quarter-over-quarter basis, even if that doesn't happen, which is very unlikely because usually countries do grow on a quarter-over-quarter basis, growth would be 5.3% in 2022. So this is huge. So Andres and I, my colleague Andres Pardo and I, we decided to upgrade. Well, actually, he decided to upgrade his call on growth to 6.5% for 2022, which is a very, very significant rate of growth. So we're going to have 10.7% in 2021, 6.5% in 2022. Now, there's something that the audience should know as well, which is that Chile and Peru grew more than Colombia in 2021. But there was a very specific reason for that, which is that the governments decided to allow people to tap into their pension funds, their individual pension funds, and take the money out so they could go and buy stuff, TVs or whatever, or help with the finances because they were having a tough time during the pandemic, etc. But Colombia never allowed that. So Colombia grew 10.7 without allowing for that very specific consumption push. So it's actually very, very. Let me put it this way. This was legitimate rate of growth. And for 2022, assuming that we don't have very difficult times during the political season, it's going to be quite simple for Colombia to outperform market expectations. And that's going to be good because, you start to stabilize debt to GDP, fiscal deficit falls faster than expected, and all this virtuous circle starts to work out. Now, in terms of the Petro issue and the ideas that he has floated, let me answer to you in terms of which one I think it's the worst. I think that by far the worst proposal from candidate Gustavo Petro is to stop the exploration of new oil for two specific reasons. Because Colombia, the fiscal accounts of Colombia depend on oil. It's as simple as that. And Renzo knows much more about that than I do. But it's very simple. It's like me saying, you know what? I'm not going to work as an economist anymore. I'm going to become a singer. Well, I'm not going to make any money if I sing because I suck at singing. So what is Colombia going to do if you can't take oil out? So you have to keep on doing that. That's the first issue. Second issue, Colombia only produces 0.35% of the CO2 that the world receives every day. Even if you close Colombia, like no more, nobody puts on the lights, nobody drives a car, it wouldn't make a single bit of a difference in terms of global warming. So why are you going to keep your people poor for something that is completely ineffective from the standpoint of global warming? So it makes absolutely no sense. So to me, that's the worst one. And the second worst one, obviously, is to print money. I mean, why are you going to do that? Just look at Argentina, look at Venezuela. It makes no sense. It's just, these are policies that don't work, and for some reason, this keep on coming up. We've tried this before. If we had not tried this before, then I say, okay, let's try it. But it doesn't work.
Thank you, Alberto. Silvana, just moving over to you for a little bit. You know, Petro can't implement any of his policies if he has a Congress that works against him, if he has a constitutional court that knocks out over his presidential decrees, etc. So with that in mind, how do you think the congressional elections are going to shape the next president's governability? What parties do you see gaining the most? What parties do you see contracting the most?
So I think we are entering a very special election right now because this is the first time that we're going to have a third round, like a 3-round elections. And this is something that we have never seen before. And Congress somehow has lost some of the visibility of the elections because of the inter-party consultation. The primaries, if we can call it like that, are gaining all or most of the attention. And I think this is a mistake in a way, because what we're seeing here is a very important Congress that will be elected in a very special moment. And coming back to what Alberto was mentioning, I think that all these ideas that Petro is referring to and taking into account, he's leading the polls, are very populist. And I think a Congress, a strong Congress, will be much needed if we have a populist president governing the country. But what is happening is that the media is not giving enough attention to the Congress. And what we expect to happen, and is very much likely to happen, is that we will have a very fragmented Congress. Why? Because none of the parties is going to get any majority whatsoever. And we expect to see things shifting around a little bit. On some of the traditional parties are going to be punished by the voters, giving their records and giving what's happening right now. Congress has now a bad reputation, and I think this is going to be a very challenging issue that the new Congress will have to face, regardless of the party that they represent. But it's interesting that we will see most likely Liberal Party and the Conservative Party will basically have the same votes that they are or have for the past 4 periods, for the past 16 years at least. This is not going to change much. Where the changes are going to be more specific or more evident are basically in the Uribe's party. So this is going to be punished, and I think that they will lose at least 5 seats in Senate. I don't know, to think about the lower house is a bit more difficult than to do projections on the Senate, and I think you agree on that. These specifics is more tricky, I would say. But in the Senate, where we can expect this punishment vote to affect both Partido de la U and Democratic Center. And we will basically see the Petro's party, this special movement that has gained some visibility and are framing themselves as a close list to the Senate and to the lower house. They're going to gain some power and they're going to get some good seats. I don't want to tell the numbers because it's very tricky, but we expect them to gain some power, not a majority, but they're going to make a good number of seats that are going to get them some advantages. And the center, if we add all the different movements that are part of the center coalition of hope, we also expect them to have good number of seats, both in the Senate and in the lower house. However, they are also having their own troubles, and they're also going through a very complicated stage of fragmentation that is probably going to affect their results in Congress as well. And some of the new parties or some of the new movements are very unlikely to get some of the seats because they don't have enough visibility. So this Congress will be very fragmented, and I think this will going to play a very important role because in our democracy, where we see the check and balances systems, evidently Congress will play a very significant role in making an institution check and balance for the executive. So we need a strong Congress, and it is still not clear how they will sort of clean that image and legitimize this process for the next election, after the election, to play that role in specific. But I believe it's very important that they do, and that they understand the responsibility that they will have in the next 4 years, regardless of who governs the country, but most specifically, if we see a populist government in Colombia.
Thank you, Silvana. And just to add to that, the next Congress gets to elect 6 out of 9 magistrates from the Constitutional Court. So that makes the check and balance from the Constitutional Court much more important in the event that a populist does make it to the presidency. But Renzo, I want to ask you something, because not only are you a rating agency, and Colombia, as you well know, does not have a consensus on ratings, but how quick do you think ratings updates will happen after the election? Because last year, ratings waited to see what happened with President Duque's tax reform before they issued any decisive, rating update. Do you think the rating update will happen immediately after the election, or do you think the rating agencies will wait until the next president appoints whomever is Minister of Finance to make a call? And also, how does this compare to ratings jumps in other countries? I know you analyzed Mexico, Panama, and Uruguay as well. Does the rating wait until the election, or it happens immediately after?
Well, I can only speak for Moody's here. And obviously, we have a very specific view about Colombia. We rated Baa2, so that is two notches within what's known as investment grade with a stable outlook. And I think it's important to highlight that when we made a decision in October of last year to change the outlook from negative to stable, our baseline scenario that supports this investment grade rating contemplated these potential political outcomes of the elections that will take place this year. And I would highlight that in this baseline scenario, we consider that something a very important factor that supports an investment grade rating for Colombia is this issue of checks and balances that stem from Congress and from the courts. And on the macroeconomic policy making side, the independence of the central bank that would, for example, likely not go in line with a policy where that would go against the mandate, which is to control inflation. And also something to highlight in terms of the fiscal reform that was passed last year is the changes to the fiscal rule, which now set very important targets that will support fiscal consolidation over the coming years. So that's an important institutional aspect of Colombia's credit profile that we think will provide an important backstop against radical changes to the economic and political model in the country going forward. There are other elements related to the economic resiliency of Colombia, and also our expectations of debt numbers, etc. So just to go back to your very specific question, we would actually probably wait to see what is a likely policy agenda of the next administration and the likelihood that those policies are to be implemented because of these institutional backstops.
No, that's great, Renzo. And over to you, Alberto, because clearly the international attention is focused on one issue, and perhaps one issue only, and that's the Ukraine crisis. And this will have an effect on all emerging market, not just the currencies, but also their position for investors, and whether they take refuge in safer currencies or the dollar even. So how do you see this affecting Colombia, both in terms of sovereign position and the stock market?
Well, first of all, before that, let me add one thing to what Silvana and Renzo were mentioning. I do think that there's another very important piece of news that we will get before the election cycle, which is who is going to be the vice presidential formula of Gustavo Petro. I think that's going to be a market-moving event. And if he's smart, he should get somebody clearly very close to the center in order to get more people to look at him in a benevolent way. In terms of the issues having to do with the international situation and the value, for example, the Colombian assets and the Ukraine issue specifically. To be completely honest, Sergio, I am extremely impressed with how well Latin American currencies have behaved with this crisis. Because I do think that this crisis is a little bit different to the other crises that we have seen in the past. Because this is Russia. And Russia is a nuclear power. This is not the same as terrorists in Yemen attacking Saudi Arabia or stuff like that. It's just completely different from that situation. This is a hardcore problem. And so I'm impressed by the resiliency that I have seen in EM currencies so far. Obviously, they're very cheap. And there was an article on Bloomberg the other day talking about, actually, we wrote about it as well, on how completely unbelievably cheap EM currencies are. Everybody that has flown from Colombia or Sao Paulo in the last months to New York will tell you that New York is a very expensive place and Sao Paulo is a very cheap place. It's actually cheaper to take the helicopter from Guarulhos to Faria Lima than to take an Uber from 46th and 5th to JFK. I can tell you because that is true. It is actually cheaper because of the undervaluation of the currencies on EM. But here's the scenario that we have, Sergio, for our countries, and for Colombia specifically. Oil prices being higher is a very positive piece of news from the current account standpoint for Colombia, so that's good. But at the same time, oil prices at 120, 130 will probably most likely generate a recession in Europe and could significantly affect the purchasing capacity of US consumers, which means that non-traditional exports of Colombia get affected, plus remittances get affected. So in terms of the effects on FX, it's kind of like a wash. Our base case, and the reason why we have this base case is because the other scenario is nuclear war, and it makes no sense to predict something like that because you can only predict it once. So, and even if you're right, it doesn't make a difference for your clients. So the base case that we have is that we have this fighting, but this is so complicated and so relevant for the world that at some point the West has to give up on the full NATO membership for Ukraine, and Russia saves face by keeping the two provinces to the up and the west, and then we have some kind of very difficult equilibrium in terms of the peace situation going forward. But this is not going to be fixed at this time. This is a problem that has gone for a very, very long time. And but in our view, from the standpoint of where we are, it's illogical to forecast that Putin is going to be overthrown. We don't think that, regardless of the sanctions, in our view, it's unlikely that will happen. So hopefully these sanctions do hurt a lot to bring everybody back to the negotiating table, and we have some kind of relatively okay solution to this. If that's the case, and it happens in the next 2 months, okay, if this lingers for longer, we have a serious problem for the world economy.
Absolutely. And while the Russian crisis was in full blast, here in Colombia, we also had a security crisis. The ELN declared an armed strike for 72 hours, and it very much showed that the government is not in territorial control of the entire country. So, Silvana, looking at the security outlook for Colombia, not just during the next 4 years, but on the onset of the elections, what do you make of it as control risks? Do you see any growing electoral risk? Do you see any growing risks for investors who are looking at the news in Colombia and are saying, "Ooh, we have a potential left-wing contender on top of all these security issues"?
Security obviously is a matter of concern, and we have seen this in the past years. It's been worsening in the past couple of years, and it's a topic that we should definitely take very seriously. The armed strike by the ELN is nothing new. You know that happened last time in 2018, and it happens every time that we have elections. So this is nothing new. But what is new is that it has become more strategic. ELN has no growth in number of men, but it has become more strategic in how they occupy the territory, in using some of their strategic corridors for usage of drugs, for all of the illicit economies. And this has become a bit more problematic. Some of the indicators that are increasing and that are of worrisome are extortion, kidnaps, and selective killings and homicides in general. So what we have seen here is that the situation overall is getting a little bit riskier. And for our clients, this is obviously a matter of concern, regardless of if they look into the elections as an opportunity for decided whether to enter or not the country, or where they are already in the country and they are obviously being impacted by the situation. In the election, one of the things that is also very interesting, or it's something that we need to take into account, is what can happen in these specific territories where violence and intimidation towards the elections per se are affecting the situation. For instance, the government just launched a specific plan called Democracy Plan that is actually in 55 municipalities that the government has identified as special territories for a higher risk of violence. And this give us the idea that these specific, the government is doing what they can, and they are trying to mitigate those risks of violence, of intimidation by the groups. What is happening, obviously, is that these acts somehow legitimize the rhetoric from the right of why we need someone stronger from the right as to provide more security to the country, and somehow is not good for other political spectrums. So to say that they are not so specifically touching upon the rhetoric of the security. Also, it is important to understand that the ELN is sending some important messages for the next government, because they want to be sitting on a table to negotiate a peace treaty. And this is relevant for them. They want to be strong when this happens. And even though this might not be the most important topic on the table in the political debate, it is a very important topic. Also, the expansion of the cocoa crops in the entire territory, and what will be the policy that each candidate has decided to move forward or not. So this is very specific. And I think, connecting to what Alberto was saying, and the obviously very important topic of Russia and Ukraine right now, is something that is more new to this election, is the risk of cyber attacks. And this is something that the government is also taking very much into consideration. We just saw what happened to the INVIMA, our agency for food and drugs, has been hacked, and we have seen so many problems with the supply chain that came out of this cyber attack. And this is a legitimate risk. This is something that us as control risk are also taking very seriously, because international actors could play a role in the cyber attack, and we have unfortunately shown that our institutions are very vulnerable to this specific risk. So I think this is also important to take into consideration, and we need to act upon these specific risks that are we seeing in security as a whole.
Thank you, Silvana. I just want to remind folks that the chat is open for questions. I have plenty more, but I want to include your questions as well. Over to Renzo. One of the things that I think is interesting, and you mentioned that the fiscal rule comes into effect this year, and Colombia has one of the lowest tax to GDP rates of the OECD. And last year's tax reform showed that a tax reform to align Colombia to the OECD, although appreciated by markets, is politically unfeasible. So what kind of tax arrangement do you think is possible in Colombia that markets would like and that could also be politically feasible? And if not, does that mean Colombia will have to leverage even more of its debt with a third party?
It's a very interesting and complicated question. So let me address it in parts. On the one hand, definitely the first reform, fiscal reform proposal was presented in April of last year, addressed some of the structural features of the tax system that we think would enable the government to increase its income. At the same time, that reform also included some elements on the expenditure side and the fiscal rule itself that were maintained in the second reform attempt that was eventually passed in September of last year. Now, there were some issues with the first reform proposal. Some of them related to the communication strategy with that initial proposal. But I think a clear example of what Colombia could do under the next administration is to follow a similar procedure to what was done for the second reform. There was clearly a greater effort to involve more parties, not only in the political spectrum, but also in overall society, that make the reform more palatable from a socio-political standpoint. Now, in terms of what could happen next under the next administration, our baseline scenario right now is that the reform that was passed last year, with the increase in revenue of just under 1% of GDP, some of those measures that address current expenditures and the changes to the fiscal rule, we think that that fiscal scenario under the next administration should be sufficient to keep debt levels constant. Of course, there are many things that can go wrong, depending on economic activity, the exchange rate, which obviously is an exogenous factor for Colombia to some degree. That said, under the next administration, one thing that we did include in our communications regarding our ready decision to change the outlook to stable, we mentioned there that we did consider a high likelihood that the next administration could pursue a new fiscal reform. We didn't say exactly when. It could be as early as 2022 or maybe 2023, which is when you will see that the full benefits of the current or the last fiscal reform that was passed. But what I would say is that the next administration will need to consider two elements. First, depending on how the economy is behaving, clearly 2021 was much better than anticipated, and so the starting point for debt metrics and economic activity overall is much more favorable than when the reform was being discussed. But if the next administration wants to accelerate the process of bringing down debt, then the government could pursue a new reform. The other element that's very important to consider is that there's still these lingering social tensions that to some degree were going to be addressed by that initial reform proposal from April with the permanent expansion of some social programs. Then if the next administration, whatever administration it is, wants to make those types of programs permanent, most likely they will need to pursue that a new reform. Now, the question is, of course, the nature of reform, etc. Now, beyond the issue of fiscal reform, there are other measures, other policy measures related to pensions, to the labor market, among other issues that could benefit economic growth, and be it productivity or making Colombia more attractive for investment. And those would also be key for the debt trajectory, which is something that I think markets are also focusing on.
Thank you very much, Renzo. I'll start taking questions from the audience, and before we close, I want to get you to answer a series of rapid fire questions. We'll do that right before we close the event. So I want to recognize Esteban Tamayo from Citi.
Thank you, Sergio. We discussed a lot about what would happen if Petro wins, and maybe discussed a lot about his policies. But as Sergio pointed out at the beginning, he's talking as if he already won. And we know that we have the primaries and also the congressional elections coming up, but we haven't discussed what happens after. And I think that the geopolitical situation right now warrants a little bit of discussion in that area as well. First off, I think I would like to get all of your opinions on can Petro actually win, even though polls show it to be likely now. I think we're in a situation where maybe a center-leading candidate in the second round could gather votes relatively easy, if you will, but I'm not sure if we're there yet after the first round. And then to add that to the mix, what's going on right now, for example, today we had some headlines saying that Putin and Maduro have signed agreements, and I know that locally this theme comes up a little bit more often than abroad, but that could play a role. So just wanted to get your take on that, and like your initial reactions to that, and are the polls trustworthy at the moment, or when will they be?
Let's start with Silvana and then over to the gentleman in New York.
Thank you, Stan, for the questions. Well, actually, for control risk, what we have been seeing so far is that it's not so sure that Petro would win. I know this is a bit controversial, given that all the polls take him, see the advantage that he has right now. But we still believe, and I know, again, this is controversial because we're seeing that the center is having a lot of troubles right now. But if they manage to overcome those situations in that they are going through, and if they actually show a face, regardless of who wins, but most likely Fajardo, establish himself as a strong candidate after the primaries, we still believe that the center is the only one, the only candidate who is likely to win against Petro in the second round. So for us, it's not so note taken that Petro will win the elections. We still believe that if we have this scenario specifically in the second round, is the country will turn themselves mostly into supporting someone that is not Petro, but this could happen only if it's someone from the center that does not get the reaction or the rejection that the right has right now. So in this scenario, we will say that Fajardo could win the election in the second round. And for the Russia question, I know this is very tricky because geostrategically speaking is very complicated where we're seeing, and we are not, even though we are geographically far away from Russia, we still have an impact. And it's also very important to say that if Putin has some specific intention or some specific area of influence right now in the world is Latin America, and this has been proven not only by what is happening in Argentina, but also in Venezuela, but also the position of countries like Argentina, like Brazil itself. Brazil has not pointed out any rejection to what Putin is doing in right now in Ukraine, and this is important because this is a geographic strategic position that is important, and then somehow Maduro will also like to take advantage. It will be very hard for me to predict or to even mention that something will happen in this area, but it's not something that we should just forget about and not even think what could happen. And considering also that economically speaking, we will see an impact of what's going on in Ukraine, that Venezuela, Argentina, and other countries in the region have businesses with Russia. They will be affected by what's happening in Russia. We all will get some impacts on the situation. So we cannot just say we're not gonna play a role in what's going on here. And I think we saw some of something that Maduro was pointing out today about some specific airplanes flying in Cartagena for using some of the NATO external affairs with Colombia. This has obviously not been rectified or pointed out as it is true or not, but definitely we are playing a role, and we will see some of the impacts of the situation no matter what.
Thank you, Renzo, and then Alberto, if you could just, we have a few questions more, so I'd like to get to them as fast as we can.
Sure. With the caveat that I'm not a polling expert or a political analyst, I would say that a lot can happen in the elections all the way through the likely runoff that we'll see in June. Clearly, particularly in that window between the first and the second presidential rounds, a lot could happen. And I think a clear example of what could go wrong if you see what happened in Peru in the elections last year. There was a candidate with a lot of anti-vote and someone that wasn't able to build coalitions that would manage to get a majority. So the question is if Colombia could do something similar to some degree what happened in the last elections in 2018 to see that potential outcome of a victor that's not Gustavo Petro. In terms of the geopolitical aspects, I don't have particular comments right now, but I think something that I would highlight is that Latin America is a region that currently has a lot of potential, but also a lot of need for investment. And that's something that should be considered in terms of how you position yourself in terms of being able to attract that investment. With that, I will conclude.
Thank you. Alberto?
Well, real quick so that we can get to other questions. Our base case is also that Petro doesn't win because we have the main reason for that call is that Petro has been in campaign mode for more than a year. His name recognition in the country, last time I checked, was 97%. So everybody knows who Petro is. And to be honest, if you're going to vote for Petro, you'll probably already say that you're going to vote for Petro because he's a very polarizing figure. In most polls, if you do average them all, I mean, you're probably 27, 29, 30%. I mean, I've seen the higher, but also lower polls. So it's not like he has, the path ready for him, and it's going to be hard for him to move away from such controversial moves. It's going to be hard for him to do something like what Boric did, which had the capacity to move much closer to the center. I agree with Silvana. It's second round. You need, let's face it, Colombia will not elect a right-wing candidate. So it's the best case scenario is that you have somebody in the center right that could go against him, or center left, who knows. I do think that for somebody like Federico Gutierrez could actually make it in an eventual second round. I agree with Silvana that Sergio Fajardo is probably an easier choice, or Alejandro Gaviria maybe, but it's not looking too good for him as far as I see it. So, but again, I do think that it's going to be a second round of todos contra Petro, cualquiera menos Petro, and people are going to vote because people are freaking. Well, at least the people that I talk to, they're freaking out.
Thanks, Alberto. Felipe had a question on the chat, and I think it just trails the point you just made, and that is whether you see that it's feasible that Oscar Iván Zuluaga will make an alliance with the Equipo Colombia after the primaries and ahead of the May 29th election. So just really quick, Silvana, and then Holly has her hand up and I want to recognize her after that.
Yes, I think it's very likely. I believe that Uribe knows that, and Oscar Iván Zuluaga knows he doesn't have many chances, so it's better if they join the winner of the center-left coalition, the center-right coalition, sorry.
Thank you. Holly, you're recognized.
Thank you. I think everybody's covered a lot, but I guess I'm curious in particular how the mood of voters this round compares to 4 years ago, because 4 years ago, there was also a lot of apathy. The choices were much clearer. We've talked a little bit in particular about where conservative voters might be going, because I think I look at turnout in Colombia is so low already, usually. If there's more apathy, if there isn't a strong candidate on the right, do those voters sit out? How motivated could they get for some of these other candidates? And how viable, especially, are some of these other names like Hernandez, like Chad? I'm curious about how that kind of shifts, especially compared to 4 years ago, where it was a much starker choice for most of the campaign. Thank you.
I'll let Alberto answer that first, and then Renzo and Silvana, if you have comments.
Actually, it's a good thing that you raised a very good point, because we didn't talk about Hernandez, and that's a possibility as well. I mean, because it's very savvy campaign. So, Mr. Hernandez, what do you think about the healthcare system? There's a bunch of crooks in government. They'll steal the money. That's it. What do you think about monetary policy? There's a bunch of crooks in government. They'll steal the money. That's the only thing he says. Everybody steals the money, and we're going to go against corruption. But he gets a pretty significant support, I guess, because the anger vote and the desperation vote after the pandemic. So I do think that if there's a second round in between Hernandez and Petro, which is not a great scenario, it would still go todos against Petro, at least from the standpoint that I hear. So I struggle to find how Petro can move away from some of the things that he has said, and that's why I find it hard for him to move increasingly to the center, because he has been pretty vocal on pretty aggressive stuff that is going to be very hard to swallow for many voters.
Absolutely. Renzo, do you have a comment? Or Silvana, we can move over to you.
Very quick comment, just to say that Hernandez is not participating in the consultation, and that will take out some visibility. He might not be on the spot right now, and I think the harder the debates get, the worse his image gets as well. So this is something that we should also take into account. But he is a phenomenon in communication in TikTok, and young people love him, which is also very curious and generate some frustration. And just to go back to Holly's point about abstention in the elections, last election we saw 47%, and I think it's very likely we see something very similar right now. I don't think the sentiment towards election has changed in the country, and we have not sort of grow up in that regard. And the fact that people do not understand exactly why we are having 3 rounds of election will make things even harder.
I received a question from Steve Donahue, and I think it's aimed at Alberto. From the business sector perspective, would you choose in the second round Petro or Rodolfo Hernandez?
That's no. I mean, here's the reason why I will answer what I will be answering. Hernandez has generated a lot of jobs in Colombia. He's a businessman. So at least he understands what creating a business is. And from the standpoint of the business community, it's better to have somebody who understands the language of how difficult it is to be an entrepreneur in Colombia and to generate business and to try to change some of the inefficiencies that exist there. Petro has never created a job, so he doesn't understand it.
We'll move over to the rapid fire questions now, and I just want you to be very brief when I ask you, each of you. 1, are you optimistic or pessimistic about Colombia in the next 4 years? Silvana?
Optimistic, but with some doubts.
Okay, Alberto?
I'm actually pretty optimistic. I can't believe the country grew 10.7%. It's something that I would have never guessed.
Renzo?
I'll take the rating agency role. If the structural reforms that are needed in the country that have been overdiagnosed in the last few years regarding not only fiscal issues but also the economy are undertaken, then Colombia has a good outlook.
Okay, number two, do you think the loser of the second round in the election will concede? Renzo.
I think Colombia has a very strong track record of democratic practices, so yes.
Alberto?
If the election is 52%, let's do a hypothetical. If the election is 52% Fajardo, 48% Petro will not concede.
Silvana?
I think if we face the situation of a cyber attack, it will be very hard to conceive. And if the election is very close, I agree with Alberto that Petro won't conceive.
Okay, number three, are institutions in Colombia strong enough to face up to an allegation of fraud and or a cyber attack to the election? Silvana?
Yes, I think I trust in our institutions, and I think we have the check and balance systems strong enough to deal with that.
Alberto?
I agree with Silvana.
Renzo?
I agree as well.
Okay, number four, will the next president be able to pass a labor reform? Renzo?
I think it will depend on the capacity to, again, build consensus, just like the case of the reform last year. If that's the case, even though there will be likely a fragmented Congress, hopefully, yes.
Alberto?
Unfortunately not. I don't think my compatriots are fully aware of why labor reform is a necessity. And it's very difficult to sell it because nobody quite understands why that is important.
Silvana?
I agree with Alberto. I don't think it's going to be that easy, and I think it's going to be one of the most difficult reforms that we need and less likely to pass.
Okay. Fifth question. Will the next president be able to pass pension reform? Silvana?
Yes, there is more knowledge about the need of the pension reform, and I think that the economy is asking for it right now, and I think that is more likely to pass.
Alberto?
I agree, and there's actually a very simple selling point to pension reform, which I hope the next president, whoever it is, uses, which is that every single person in Colombia that receives a pension in the high end, north of 20 minimum salaries, the government subsidizes that pension by more than 65 million pesos per year. If people don't understand that and why that is a problem, then we have a serious education problem. I think that people will understand that that makes absolutely no sense.
Renzo?
Yes, much more likely.
Okay. There's another question here that I think is interesting. And can you just tell us one thing about the election that you're watching that may change your outlook on the entire thing? For me, it's turnout. Silvana?
I think it's the capacity of each coalition to recognize and compromise with the outcome.
Alberto?
I would agree with Silvana. I do think that your point is also very relevant. But again, I think that the nature of this election is going to be todos contra Petro.
Renzo?
Just to try to say something different here. I think we would probably look again in terms of particularly the results of the upcoming elections in a couple of weeks. If our baseline scenario where the institutions will be there as checks and balances will persist.
Well, there you have it, folks. Alberto, Renzo, and Silvana, it's been a true pleasure to moderate this conversation between us. I've learned a lot. Thank you for the participants who asked questions. And of course, thank you to the America Society and Council for the Americas for hosting this. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Sergio. You did a great job. And thank you, Alberto, Silvana, and Renzo. I think we've added some resources on the chat. I think there's a podcast and some outlooks, etc. So we're going to continue updating that, and we're going to continue doing events like this. So watch this space and make sure that you're getting our emails. And if you're not, you have our emails from this RSVP. So Thank you for joining us, and the video of this will be on our website soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.